Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. We're the place where we take your sources, really dig into them, and pull out the key insights for you. Quick and informed.
Exactly, helping you get up to speed.
So today, we're doing a deep dive based on a study that looks at part one of a really significant work. The Promised Day is Come. It's by Shoghi Effendi.
And the source we're examining today frames this book, The Promised Day Has Come, as, well, more than just history. It's presented as this academic but still accessible analysis.
Right, of a key period in world history, but seen through a, let's say, a specific spiritual lens.
That's a good way to put it, a very particular lens.
So our mission here is to explore that lens. We're going to dig into the historical events, think 19th, early 20th centuries as this text interprets them. How does it link all that turmoil to spiritual claims and prophecies?
And it's really important, I think, to keep the context in mind. This book, The Promised Day Has Come, was written in 1941.
Okay, so right in the middle of another global upheaval, World War II.
Exactly. And it's looking back at the decades before that, all the massive changes, and basically making an argument about why it all happened, what it all meant.
So it's offering a kind of spiritual key to understanding modern history. Where do we start with the work itself, based on our source material?
Okay, so the source introduces the author, Shoghi Effendi, and make sure to note his position. He was the guardian of the Bahá'í Faith.
Which means he was the head of the faith after its initial founders.
That's right. And the book, from 41, its purpose is really to give this distinct historical and theological reading of those very chaotic times, the 1800s and early 1900s.
Yeah, and the core argument,
Yeah.
What's the main claim it's making about that whole period?
Well, it's pretty bold. The central claim is that all those huge global shifts, the wars, revolutions, empires collapsing, they weren't just random chaos. Instead, the book argues they're directly linked to prophetic warnings and promises, specifically those made by Bahá'u'lláh, the founder of the Baha'i Faith, and his forerunner, the Bab.
So it sees these huge world-shaking events as having sort of a dual meaning. Like, on one hand, it's divine retribution.
Precisely. Divine judgment, or maybe chastisement is the word used, for humanity basically rejecting this new spiritual message.
But not just that.
No, because at the same time, it views these events as, like, the signals, the birth pangs, really, of a new world order trying to emerge.
Wow. Okay, so that's the fundamental lens our source highlights, judgment and birth.
That's the core interpretive framework. Yeah.
Okay, that's definitely a powerful starting point. Let's get into some of the key themes that our source study pulls out from this first part of the book. First one, divine judgment and retribution.
Right. So as the source explains it, this theme basically takes all those catastrophes, World War I is a huge example, but also the fall of empires, societal breakdowns, and presents them as divine chastisement.
And this punishment, according to the text's interpretation, it's specifically because of how humanity responded, or maybe didn't respond, to Baha'u'llah's message.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
The source really emphasizes that the text draws direct lines between the collapse of specific regimes, specific religious structures, and their leaders either ignoring or actively fighting against Baha'u'llah's claims.
Which leads us straight into the next theme, doesn't it? Prophecies fulfilled.
Yes.
How does the book actually demonstrate this connection? How does it link the warnings to what happened historically, according to our source?
Well, it doesn't just make a general statement. It points to specific historical moments, specific figures, and frames them as direct fulfillments of warnings Baha'u'lláh had sent out to world leaders.
Okay, can you give us some of the main examples, the ones our source really flags?
Sure. One key example is Napoleon III of France. He receives a communication, a tablet from Baha'u'lláh.
Right.
And according to the text, his pretty rapid downfall later on, his defeat, is presented as a direct result of ignoring that message.
Okay, that's quite direct. What else?
Then there's Sultan Abdulaziz. He was the ruler of the Ottoman Empire when Baha'u'lláh was exiled and imprisoned within his territory.
A major world power at the time.
Absolutely. And the source points out how the book connects Baha'u'llah's warnings to him with what happened later in Turkey, the end of the Sultanate, the end of the Caliphate. These huge ancient institutions just gone.
Wow. Linking vast geopolitical events directly to a spiritual warning given decades earlier, what about in Persia, the birthplace of the faith?
Yes, the source highlights the case of Nasir-ud-Din Shah, the Persian king. His government was responsible for intense persecution, first of the Bab and his followers, and then of Baha'u'lláh and the Baha'is.
And the text interpretation.
It frames his assassination later on as a direct consequence, a kind of divine justice for that persecution. The source also mentions that a warning sent to Pope Pius IX is referenced in the book, too.
So it's very specific. It names names, names events. This connects clearly to another theme our source study mentions, the decline of old world orders. There's a contrast being drawn.
Yes, definitely. The book draws a stark contrast. On one side, you have these old systems, monarchies, powerful clergy, empires visibly crumbling. And the text views them as having become corrupt or just deaf to spiritual truth.
And on the other side?
On the other side, you have the rise and spread of the Baha'i Faith, which seemed improbable at the time, given the opposition, but the text presents it as the seed, the blueprint, for a new kind of global order.
And our source mentioned that powerful metaphor, the dual phenomenon, to describe this.
It did, yes. That's a really key insight from the source's analysis. The text isn't just cataloging destruction when it looks at these collapsing empires.
It's seeing something else happening simultaneously.
Exactly. It interprets it through this double lens. It sees these events as, quote, the death pangs of a dying civilization, and at the same time, the birth pangs of a new world order.
So chaos and creation are intertwined.
That's the idea, transformation arising directly out of the breakdown.
What about the role of established religion in all this, in this story of decline and change?
Well, the text, according to our source, delivers a pretty sharp critique, especially aimed at the religious leaders of the time, with specific examples from Christianity and Islam.
What's the criticism?
They're presented as having failed in their duty, failed to recognize Bahá'u'lláh and his message. The book calls this a fundamental betrayal of their divine mandate.
A strong charge. And the consequence of this failure, as the text sees it.
The source points out that the book directly links the weakening or even collapse of traditional religious authority. It specifically mentions the decline of Shia Islam in Persia to their opposition to this new revelation.
So it's framed as a spiritual failing that leads to real-world institutional decline.
That's the argument being made, yes. A direct link.
It really sounds like the author, Shoghi Effendi, isn't holding back in this interpretation. Our source also mentioned the language itself, the imagery used in the book. Can you share some examples of that? What does the source highlight?
Oh, absolutely. The source really emphasizes the literary force of the writing. One really vivid metaphor it points to is the tempest of God's wrath.
Okay.
And it quotes this passage. A tempest, unprecedented in its violence, unpredictable in its course, catastrophic in its immediate effects, unimaginably glorious in its ultimate consequences, is at present sweeping the face of the earth.
Wow. I mean, that really captures the feeling of living through those times, the chaos of the early 20th century. But then adding unimaginably glorious in its ultimate consequences, that totally reframes the chaos, doesn't it?
Completely. It's not just describing a storm, it's overlaying it with a spiritual purpose, a meaning.
Right.
And think back to the warning to kings, specifically Sultan Abdulaziz again. The source quotes the words attributed to Baha'u'lláh in the book, addressed to the Sultan. Soon will he seize you in his wrathful anger, and your dominions will be disrupted.
And the text explicitly says, look, he was overthrown, he was killed, his empire was disrupted.
Yeah.
This validates the warning. It's presented as almost a direct cause and effect.
It's exactly that. Very direct. And similarly, with the Khazar dynasty in Persia, their downfall isn't just seen as, political change.
Yeah.
As depicted in the text, it's presented as divine justice playing out because of how they treated the Bab and the Baha'is.
And there was that line our source mentioned, too, about the dust of irreligion hath enwrapped all men. What does that convey?
It paints this picture of a world the author saw as being spiritually lost, disconnected, maybe focused too much on material things. And the text suggests this widespread irreligion was another reason the old ways were breaking down. They lacked a spiritual foundation.
Okay. So putting it all together, how does our source studies summarize Shoghi Effendi's overall approach in writing part one?
Well, the source describes it as this potent mix. You've got historical rigor. It does detail the political collapses, the social changes. Then there's theological depth, interpreting everything through this framework of divine judgment, prophecy, fulfillment, and finally, real literary power, using that vivid language, those metaphors we talked about.
So it's history, but viewed through this very intense, spiritually charged lens. And the source notes this is kind of a challenge to the reader.
It definitely is. It challenges you, the reader, to think about history differently, not just as politics and economics, cause and effect in the usual sense, but through the spiritual perspective where, as the source puts it, things like moral and spiritual failures aren't just abstract concepts. They have tangible, real-world consequences, even on a global scale.
Okay, so let's bring it back to you listening now. Why should you care about digging into this particular interpretation of history? What's the relevance today of looking at the 19th and 20th centuries through this specific framework presented in the source?
Well, I think it offers a radically different way to try and make sense of big world events, both then and maybe now too.
How so?
It makes you ask, what if the things driving history aren't just the usual suspects, economics, politics, power struggles? What if there's a whole other dimension, a spiritual or moral one, that's deeply woven into those shifts?
And how might exploring the spiritual lens, as described in the source, actually change how you think about, say, the big upheavals or societal changes we see happening around the world today?
It could encourage looking beneath the surface of immediate crises, asking if there might be deeper currents, maybe even spiritual dynamics involved. I mean, if you entertain the premise just for a moment that the spiritual health of a society affects its stability, its structures, well, that adds a whole different layer to understanding today's challenges, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It suggests crisis isn't just random breakdown.
Exactly. It offers a framework, this particular framework, for seeing crisis potentially as part of something bigger. A process that might be painful, yes, but maybe purposeful, aimed at some kind of transformation, building something new.
That's definitely a different perspective than you get from most historical analysis.
It really is. It pushes you to think about the core health of societies, not just economically, politically, but maybe spiritually too, and how that might shape where things are headed.
So, to sum up this first part, based on our source study, part one of The Promised Day essentially lays down this foundational argument.
Absolutely. It sets the whole stage. It puts forward the core idea that the massive upheavals of the 19th and early 20th centuries are, from this perspective, evidence of divine justice, the first signs of a new era being born.
Right, grounding that claim in specific historical events and how it interprets prophecy.
It's presented as this really potent combination, prophecy, history, and also a strong moral message.
Yeah.
Using the past to say something about the present and the future.
It's like a complete narrative, a spiritual key for understanding world events.
That's how the source presents its function, yes.
Which leaves us and you with something to chew on, drawing from this source's analysis. If you consider this viewpoint where the collapse of old systems, empires, religious hierarchies isn't just chance, but linked to spiritual causes, and it's seen as the difficult birth of a new order within this global tempest. Well, what might that imply, according to this view, about where humanity is ultimately heading? Or maybe what humanity is being called towards even when things look chaotic today?